But Curum faoir fáilte rih Chris Nocht agus Taishev Galer is Mahan Rud Gwil an Seo Nocht. Chris, you're very welcome to join us tonight. And friends, Chris Baker, who started his adult life as a Birmingham engineer, now lives in Leamington Spa. And he sees himself nowadays as a freelance military historian. And apart from the science degrees that he has in connection with his engineering, he has an MA now in First World War Studies. And he's also chair of the Western Front Association and a member of the Royal Historical Society and various other societies like that. He has published 5 books to date, which leaves us all spellbound. But nevertheless, he has received high praise from the BBC's programme, Who Do You Think You Are? And in 2014, he was the winner of the Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals Prize for his website, The Long, Long Trail, which some of you may be familiar with. There's no end to this man's talents, and he has dedicated himself, it seems, completely to the history of the First World War. So I'm looking forward very much to hearing what he has to say today, because like many of you, I'm sure you had relatives who were involved in it. So without further ado, I want you to welcome Chris Baker. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you, John. That was a very kind introduction. I'm going to share some slides on the screen in a minute, but I'll just begin by saying, yeah, I have really, for the last 13 years, I've been working full time on First World War history.
Quiet.
But it all came because of my own grandfather, who died before I was born. And that, you know, was a boyhood mission, if you like, to find out more about what happened to him. So it's been a personal interest of mine for a long time. I have very, very little personal connection with Ireland, except my late uncle Jerry Riley from Dublin, who settled in Birmingham. My wife has a much closer connection, which I'll explain later on if we need to go that far. Right, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you'll be able to see this in a moment. Right, let's get the slides up there. So with luck, you can see that. Put your thumb up or something if you can see that. Can you see my slide? You can, great. Right, I'm going to speak for probably 30, 40 minutes. We'll have plenty of time for questions afterwards, I hope. I've pitched this at a level that I hope will be useful. And I'm talking about the Irish soldier in the Great War, the First World War. I do pick out a couple of specific individuals, but I'm really trying to talk about context. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to explain how the Irish regiments, the specific Irish regiments, fitted into the British Army and what they did during the war, but also how it was that so many other elements of the British forces found themselves in Ireland during the Great War and what they did. And I'm going to weave in and out of it some guidance on how you go about researching individual soldiers, because that is a really quite a complex mission. And because of the nature of the records and the way they've been digitized and split up, it's not an easy thing to do. So that's what I'm going to set out to try to do. I'm going to start here. Ireland had been used as a strong recruiting base by the British Army for many decades before the First World War. And you can see from the map on the screen there that the Irish regiments each had a defined recruitment area. You didn't have to go and join your local regiment, but the probability was that if you were considering joining the army, you would probably do so. The regiments, you can see that they're listed on the page, and my red dots are where each regiment had its main training depot up to 1914, and in most cases beyond it. It's reckoned that when the war came in August 14, there were about 58,000 Irish men serving in the British Army. It's not a very easy figure to nail down because it depends really whether you include only men who are resident in Ireland or men who are of Irish birth who've gone to live elsewhere in Great Britain or even further beyond that and have come into the army. But they think about 58,000, and a large proportion of them were serving within the Irish regiments listed there. But there were other elements of the army that had Irish roots. There were 4 regiments of cavalry, mounted soldiers, and you can see from their titles that they had a background or history in Ireland. They weren't normally based in Ireland, but they did have 2 training bases, one at Dublin, one at Waterford, which are my yellow dots on the map there. And there were a number of other regiments that had strong Irish connections too. The Irish Guards, which were normally based in Britain. 2 regiments that were part-time. I'll come on to describe what the Special Reserve is soon, but the North and South Irish Horse. Mounted regiments, again, based in Belfast and Dublin. But a man could also join any of the other parts of the British Army, regardless of where he came from. If he wanted to join the regular army before the First World War, he could quite easily choose to go into the Royal Artillery, for example, rather than one of the Irish infantry regiments or the cavalry listed here. But those are certainly the parts of the army that got a normal and historic connection to Ireland. So if I look at how a man came to be in the army at all in the period before the war, you start to get some patterns that help when you're interpreting service records. So the main way of joining the army would be to join as a regular soldier. You had a free choice. You could determine which regiment you wanted to go into, but you would have to sign up for 12 years. And that would be made up of a period of full-time service, followed by a period on reserve. And normally, for most regiments, that would be 7 years full-time, 5 on reserve. When you'd finished that full-time and then your element, you'd go into the reserve. They were in 2 different sections. There's a technical difference, which I won't bore you with this evening. And you'd do your 5 years as a reservist there. All it meant was you'd go for an annual training camp and you got paid for that. If you liked that life, you could extend your regular service by another 4 years in Section D reserve. So if I put that on a timeline, if, for example, a man had joined the regular army in 1909, he would still be in his full-time element when war came. And he wouldn't need to be called up. He's already serving, and he is probably amongst those who are sent overseas very early in the war. But you go back in time, let's say your man joined up in 1905, he would have finished his full-time service, but be a reservist. In the case I've got here, he's a B reservist. He would be called up. When war comes, all of these reservists get a notice to rejoin their regiment. So he'd be in his in the second part of his 12 years, if you like. If you go back even further, a man may well have already finished his 12 years completely and either now be a civilian, or if he'd extended his service by going into Section D reserve, he would still be a reservist and called up just like the others. So from a genealogy viewpoint, this is quite important, because if we track back to when the census was taken in 1911, my men who joined up in 1905 and 1909 are serving soldiers, and you would find them in either the census of Ireland or the census of Great Britain, depending on where he was serving at the time. But my man who joined up in 1900 isn't a serving soldier at the time of the census, he's a reservist. So he will be at home somewhere. as a civilian, and the census will give his civilian occupation. So it's not always easy, if all you've got to work on is a census, to tell whether he is a soldier in his reserve service or not. But it's quite an interesting indicator that you start to get, that if you know your man had joined the army by 1911, he may be shown in the census as a soldier or not, depending on exactly when he joined and what his status was. There was another way of joining the army. Again, it was free choice of regiment. It was a thing called the Special Reserve. It was effectively a part-time service. You signed up for 6 years. You had a few months of full-time training, and then you just went along for annual camp. This was the only type of part-time service that was available to men resident in Ireland. And just like the regular army, if you joined as a special reservist, then part of your terms would be, if we go to war, you're going to be called up and we can send you overseas. So men would have had that in writing from the day they began. And special reservists did the same sort of training as the regulars for a few months. Then they go on their annual camp and they received good reserve pay for doing that. It's instructive as well to look at where the Irish regiments were actually serving in the period up to the Great War. If I take the first example, the Royal Irish Rifles, they had 5 battalions, 2 regular battalions, full-time soldiers. 1 was serving in Aden in the Middle East, 1 was based in England, and they had 3 others, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th battalions in Ireland. They were training units. That pattern is repeated. If I go down through the Irish regiments like this, you can see that they've all got a similar pattern. They've all got 2 battalions. Normally, one is somewhere within the British Empire, India typically. The other one is at home, but only one of them, the Leinsters, the 2nd Battalion, is actually in Ireland. All of the training units are in Ireland. So if we keep going, Irish Guards are based in England, and the cavalry is mainly in India, 1 in England, 1 at home in Ireland. And the North and South Irish Horse, which are carrying out training of special reservists, are not yet embodied, which is a word meaning they've been called up for war. So actually in Ireland itself, despite the fact that there are lots of Irish regiments there are only actually 2 units full-time, the 2nd Leinsters and the 5th Royal Irish Lancers cavalry, that are stationed in Ireland. All of the others are training units. So they are not full strength. They are men, some of them have literally just joined and are beginning their basic training. Others have been in the army for a while and are coming back for their annual camps. So the actual presence of Irish regiments in Ireland when war came along was not very extensive. But there were thousands of British Army troops in Ireland. All of these units I've listed here, and forgive me, some of them are abbreviated just to get them on the screen, they are all in Ireland. So for example, on my right-hand list, the 1st Battalion of the East Kent Regiment has got a light green dot against it, and I've put that on the map as where exactly they were stationed. The 1st Royal Fusiliers, you know, you can see them all on the map here. And down the left-hand side, the cavalry, the Royal Horse Artillery, Royal Field Artillery, and Royal Garrison Artillery. All of these British units are stationed in Ireland, partly because Ireland's a good and open countryside for training, but also as a garrison in the event of any difficulties. So despite the fact we've got relatively few presence of Irish regiments, Ireland is packed full of British troops in August 1914. Most of these units come under command of 2 different formations, which quite quickly get sent to France in August 1914. I'll come back to that shortly. But just to continue the story about how a man came into the army, in England, Wales, and Scotland, a thing called the Territorial Force was created. It didn't come into existence in Ireland. It was another form of part-time service. But interestingly, there were 2 battalions raised that had a specific Irish connection. One in Liverpool, not surprisingly, perhaps the 8th Battalion of the King's Liverpool Regiment. It was an Irish battalion, and the 15th Londons were the London Irish. So both, although they were part of the British Army and they were based in England all the time, they came out of an Irish tradition in areas with a strong Irish population. The terms of serving in the Territorial Force did not oblige a soldier to be sent overseas. He could agree to be sent if he signed a second form of agreement. Now, when war comes along, a whole new type of service is created. You can see on the left there the sort of famous recruiting campaign under Lord Kitchener of the time. There was a major campaign to get men to voluntarily enlist into the army, but on a much shortened commitment. So war comes, and within a week or 2, you could join the army for 3 years or the duration of the war, with all sorts of commitments that if once it finished, they would release you as quickly as possible. And an enticement was added in that married men or men who were supporting a dependent parent could get an additional payment called a separation allowance to do that. And that was entirely to get men to join voluntarily to expand the army very quickly. Now, hundreds of thousands of men volunteered within a few months, and they were formed up into battalions of the infantry and units of the artillery and what have you. But out of that, 3 major formations were created: the 10th and 16th Irish divisions and the 36th Ulster division, specifically Irish. I'm going to go through each of them and what they did shortly. But interestingly, in England, and this is where a connection with my own wife comes in the northeast of England, there was a drive to get men of Scots or Irish background or tradition to join up into specific units of the Northumberland Fusiliers, which is an English regiment. And 4 battalions were created, known as the Tyneside Irish. They were created into a brigade of 4 battalions. So you had not only the 3 Irish formations raised, you had a very specific one from the northeast of England. And my wife's connection is typical in that she had I think it was her great-great-grandfather emigrated from County Tyrone in the early 1800s, came across, settled in the northeast of England. So we had 2 or 3 generations more by the time the Great War comes along, but there's still a strong traditional connection back to Ireland, and a lot of active Irish political, I was going to say political activism, that's exactly what it is, in the northeast. So created an Irish brigade in the northeast of England. So, having given you a bit of background about how men came into the army, I'll just pick out one example, a man I researched not so long ago, James Bolger. Now, he joined up in 1900 as a regular soldier. He was from Waterford. At the time, Britain was at war in South Africa, and he joined up at a time of war. He decided to join the cavalry, the Royal Irish Lancers. He actually trained in England. He went to South Africa for a while and took part in some action in South Africa, and he got the campaign medal for his part in that war. Came home with his regiment, He clearly liked being in the army. He changed his terms to stay for an extra full-time year. So his 12 years was fixed, but he now had 8 full-time. And then, at his own request, he changed regiments completely. He clearly had an affection for working with horses. He transferred to the Veterinary Corps. He then came out of his full-time service and went into reserve. He got married while he was a reservist. He appears in the census of 1911 as a civilian, and he's discharged at the end of his 12 years, perfectly normally. But then, not untypically, when the war came along, it took him a little while. He's a married man with children by now. He doesn't rush into it, but he rejoins. He joins a different regiment, the Army Service Corps, but he's in an element that trains horses, which is called the Remount Service. He goes to France. He serves at a horse training depot for the rest of the war, and he comes out into a reserve, and he's discharged in 1920. So for a pre-war regular soldier, that is not an untypical sort of story. I've got fantastic detail of his 12 years from the service record that exists. It's in the London National Archives in a particular collection, WO97. But there's very little left of his First World War service. His record was, with many others, lost when the Army Record Centre was hit by the Luftwaffe in the first air raid in London in 1940 and destroyed. His record was lost, and I could only rebuild his story in outline from other records for that period. And again, that's not untypical. If you have a man who's serving before the First World War, it's quite typical to find lots about his service before the war, much less during the war. It's a great shame, but that's the way it rolls. And in finding him, now I know you're recording this and you'll be able to see it, but you can look it up on my website, The Long, Long Trail, as well. Where are these things? Well, they're all online. The problem for us all as researchers is they're not all online in the same place. The UK National Archives has managed to get them digitized by all sorts of different providers, and that means you and I have to pay money to lots of different providers to get at these records. It drives me mad. So the service records, the detail of a man's medical history, the units he served with, the training he had, and all that sort of thing. Find My Past and Ancestry have them digitized. Find My Past is a better source, in my opinion, than Ancestry, mainly because they have made a much better job of indexing the records. I would say that for every 10 records I find in Find My Past, I only find 9 or even 8 of them in Ancestry. And that's because Ancestry have done such a terrible job of indexing them. They've got them, they're there, I just can't find them. So Find My Past is a better source. Officers' service records are not digital. They're only available from the National Archives. And if a man continued to serve after 1921 in the British Army, which of course is an interesting question for men from Ireland, whether he did or not, they are still held by the UK Ministry of Defence. Medal rolls are a really good, solid source of information about soldiers. They all exist. They are all digitized. Ancestry is the only one that has the complete image of the medal roll pages. Find My Past and others only have transcripts or the index cards that allow you to find these things. So here I am saying, on the one hand, I need Find My Past for my service records, but I also need Ancestry for my medal rolls. This is why it drives me completely nuts. They're all over the place. But to search a man like James Bolger also means going into, if you're going to do it thoroughly, going into lots of other areas. There's a fantastic collection of military pension records that were about to be thrown away in 2012. The Western Front Association rescued them, and they're now digital. and available through Ancestry or Fold 3, which is the Ancestry military subsection, if you like. Casualty lists, although they didn't apply in James Bolger's case, are relatively easy to find in newspapers. The National Library of Scotland is a fantastic free resource which has all of the British casualty lists for 1917 and 1918, easily found online, easily searched. There are relatively few records of admissions to hospitals, but those that do exist are now online. Peter was saying before we began that he got some prisoner of war records from the International Committee of the Red Cross. They've done a good job of digitization. They are German records in the main. They're not terribly easy to search, but they are free of charge and worth looking at every time. Oh my goodness, sorry, I've just gone on too far. Even if your man wasn't taken prisoner, if he was declared as missing in action and later found to be killed, there's probably a record for him in the prisoner of war records, which came out of enquiries that were made when a man was missing. Awards for bravery and gallantry are also free of charge to find through the London Gazette, which is the official newspaper of the British Parliament. All of those awards were listed in there, and the higher awards have a citation describing why the man was given the award and usually the date of the action that he carried out. So there's a great array of different records to go through, even for a man with a story as relatively straightforward as James Bolger, my Waterford cavalryman. So let's go into the war now. We've got a bit of background. When war comes in August 14, the British government declare war on Germany 4th of August. They issue orders to mobilize the army, and all those reservists go back to their regiments, like in the photograph behind there. And quite quickly, Parliament passes the Defence of the Realm Act in Britain and Ireland, which starts to introduce quite severe controls over individual liberty and to begin to have a basis for government taking control of more and more factors of life, of employment, and so forth. Quite quickly, the 5th and 6th Division, which were the formations under which most of the units based in Ireland came, were sent to France. So all of those British units that had been in Ireland suddenly went to France. Sir Edward Carson calls upon the men serving in the Ulster Volunteer Force to enlist in the British Army. Many of them do. Shortly after that, the British government passes the Third Home Rule Bill, but immediately the Suspensory Act, which means that the enactment of Home Rule for Ireland won't happen until the end of the war, comes in at the same time. And James Redmond, shortly afterwards, begins to call upon the Irish volunteers to enlist into the British Army, with mixed results, we should say. So this all begins to happen very, very quickly. Things change in Britain and Ireland very quickly as the army is mobilized, the regulars begin to go overseas, and various laws and controls start to kick in. Now, this could be another talk or two in its own right about enlistment in Ireland through the war and how it was encouraged and what happened. I've picked out a couple of interesting posters here. I'm not going to go into them, but the messaging that tried to get men to voluntarily enlist was intriguing, to say the least. You know, farmers of Ireland, defend your possessions. Well, the farms of Ireland were never seriously threatened by German invasion during the war. This is almost psychological warfare on men to try to get them to enlist. And you add that to the availability of separation allowance and, you know, all the other encouragements to go in. The propaganda of enlistment is an intriguing subject. So all of those British units that I'd listed as being in Ireland in 1914, suddenly are no longer there. They've been sent to France. The only ones that are left are a field artillery brigade right in the middle of the country here, and some Royal Garrison artillery, which are fixed guns covering the approach to Cove and Cork Harbour. The Irish training units are still here, but the British Army full-time regulars have, to all intents, gone very quickly. So what happens over the next couple of years? Well, the voluntary enlistment in Ireland proceeds well at a rate comparable to what's going on elsewhere in Scotland, England, and Wales. And it's believed that about 206,000 Irish men resident in Ireland served in the forces through the war. All volunteers if they lived in Ireland. Volunteers with a small v, that is. They all enlisted voluntarily. About 80,000 of them are believed to have had no connection at all with the pre-war Irish volunteers or Ulster volunteers. So these are men who were either perhaps too young to get involved in those kinds of things, or had no political motivation to get involved in them. But a very large number did. So you've got large numbers of men who had been in the volunteers in Ireland or in the Ulster volunteers joining up. And of the 206,000 or thereabouts, 27,000 Irishmen lost their lives in the Great War. Now, as a proportion of the 206, that is high compared to Scotland and England and Wales. And that may be because the majority of Irish men joined infantry regiments. Infantry are the men that go over the top, who go and advance into machine gun fire towards the enemy. And inevitably, the losses to infantry are proportionately higher than to the engineers, the artillery, the horse transport, and all those other parts of the army. So it's likely to be the fact that Irishmen joined the infantry rather than any specific political use of Irish formations as a assault force, for example, that led to that proportion being high, but it is high. Now, I've stolen this map from elsewhere. I think it's quite a good one, but I'm going to overlay it to try and explain, well, where did Irishmen serve? Because I know from my own experience of working with many clients over the years in Ireland, this is not well understood generally. The majority of them served in France and Flanders, in what's often called the Western Front, in France and Belgium, fighting against German forces, vast majority there. It's the biggest theatre of war. It's the one where the casualties are the greatest. But elsewhere too, in 1915, for 8 months, the British forces were engaged at Gallipoli, which is part of Turkey. I won't go through the background of what that campaign was all about. It didn't last very long. It was very bloody, very grisly, with huge proportions of sickness too. But Irish soldiers were there in great number before that campaign was closed down. Egypt had been effectively a British protectorate from before the war, but the war developed across into what is now Israel, Palestine, and Syria. And large numbers of Irishmen were engaged there too from 1916 to 1918. There was a campaign as well in Mesopotamia, today's Iraq, which began as a very small affair to try and protect a British-owned oil field, but developed into a much larger campaign. Fewer casualties, but much higher rates of sickness. And there were large numbers of Irishmen there too. And I'm going to show you how in a minute. A very little known campaign is one here in Greece and Macedonia. It's known as Salonika. Very complicated politics. A force was sent there in 1915 which was not heavily engaged at all until 1918, and then it had a major breakthrough offensive towards the end of the war, in which Irishmen played a central role. And finally, late 1917 and 18, British forces were active in northern Italy as well. Not so many Irish troops here, one or two of the Irish battalions, but not large numbers of Irish resident soldiers. So you can see all over the place. These were the main theatres of war. Irish soldiers did serve elsewhere. For example, there was a long campaign in East Africa with relatively few British white troops involved, but those that were there were often in the medical or transport corps, and there were certainly Irish soldiers out in East Africa. So all over the place. So a quick look through what happened to the 3 Irish divisions that were raised in 1914. The first one, the 10th Irish Division, was actually the first Irish formation of the British Army ever to serve overseas as such. It was raised in 1914. All of its infantry was Irish. Its artillery and engineers and transport and so on were mixed. It moved to England to complete its training in 1915. It landed at Suvla Bay at Gallipoli in 1915, but was quite soon pulled out of there and sent to Salonika. Later on, it went to Egypt and Palestine. So it's one of the very few formations that went into 3 theatres of war. It had a really important role in a breakthrough battle in Beersheba in Israel. And then in 1918, it was kind of broken down. A lot of the European or British and Irish units were taken out back to the Western Front in France and replaced by units of the Indian Army. So it kind of ceased to be an Irish division at that point. But it suffered 9,300 casualties. Hard to believe. A division, by the way, is about 12,000. So it's lost about 3/4 of its original strength over the years. Very substantial number. The second division to be raised, the 16th Irish Division, also went to England to complete its training, but it served in France. The memorial you can see here, very similar to the one that I showed in Salonika on the previous slide, is in the village of Guillemont on the Somme in France, which is where the 16th Division fought its first major action. It went on to fight at Messines near Ypres and Langemarck near Ypres in 1917. Major defensive battle in 1918 in which it suffered very heavy losses. It was to such extent it was taken back to England to be rebuilt. And after that point, rather like the 10th, it ceased to be an Irish division at that point. Went back to France. But look at the number of casualties here. It's lost more than twice its original strength. That is the difference between fighting in France and fighting in the other theatres of war. France was a much more deadly place to be. And the third one, slightly different, the 36th Ulster Division, was raised almost entirely by the Ulster Volunteer Force in 1914, men who had already been armed and training in the north. Again, it didn't have its own artillery or engineers or transport. They were generally English units. It moved to England. It also served in France. And you can see 2 of the names, Messines and Langemarck. It served alongside the 16th Irish Division. But it too had its first major engagement on the Somme. And this wonderful building in the picture is a replica of a tower in County Down, near which the division carried out its training. This is on the Somme, near the village of Thiepval, and forms a memorial to the 36th Division. That also lost an enormous number of casualties during the Great War. And in more recent years, for the first time, there's been a memorial to, as you can see from its name, the island of Ireland, a peace park built near Messines, where the 2 divisions fought near Ypres, that commemorates all of them. Very pleasant. It's built almost on the spot where the 2 divisions went into attack side by side. Not quite, it's about half a mile off the precise position, but it's good enough. So if we skip to Easter 16, given that I've said that most of the British Army's been sucked out of Ireland, except for the training units of the Irish regiments, what was actually there when events kicked off in Easter? Well, you can see from the list of what was available to be deployed into Dublin, it's a really mixed bag. You have some of the reserve units of the cavalry and Irish infantry. You have a training cavalry brigade that was at the Curragh at Newbridge that was also moved into Dublin. There were various bits and pieces of artillery and men sent from elsewhere. So it's a real mixed bag until a couple of days later, you had a largely untrained division of territorials sent to Ireland from England, the North Midland Division. They came from Staffordshire, Leicestershire, Lincolnshire, Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, that area. These fellows in the photograph escorting a man they've arrested or captured are from that division. And they got themselves into serious bother on advancing into Dublin, as I'm sure you know. It was also one of the units at that division that committed a certain atrocity in Dublin within a few days of arrival. So their reputation can't be said to be good. At that point, they were largely out of control and pretty untrained. But later, they were taken back to England. They completed their training, went to England, and actually performed very well in France. So an interesting history. But after the events of Easter, the British government took steps to rebuild the garrison in Ireland. And it did so by moving lots of training units into Ireland. All of these units that I've listed here arrived in Ireland in the second half of 1916 through to 1918, with the exception of the Highland Cyclist Battalion. They are all training units of various sorts. So once again, you had a huge British Army presence in Ireland, but unlike the previous garrison before the war, these are not trained regular soldiers. They are often 18-year-old boys, 19-year-olds going through their training in what was becoming, for some of them, an increasingly hostile environment in which to be, particularly by 1918. And of course, in that year, we had one of the other great political military crises of the war in Ireland, which was the campaign against the introduction of conscription. In 1916, conscription had come into effect in the rest of Great Britain. So it introduced compulsory service. When you were 18, you were called up for military service, whether you liked it or not. Politically, it was resisted in Ireland, and any enlistment in Ireland continued to be voluntary. But as manpower was becoming increasingly scarce for the British Army in France, there was greater pressure to get more men enlisted in Ireland through conscription. And of course, it was resisted in Ireland to the point of general strike, and so on and so on and so on. And I'm sure you know the rest of the story. So conscription was never introduced in Ireland the way it was in the rest of Great Britain. So it holds an honour that all men resident in Ireland were serving voluntarily rather than by being compelled to do so. So here's another man, an example for you, and you'll be glad to know I'm approaching the end here. Here's another man, Patrick. I looked at him quite recently, only a couple of months ago. Young lad, came from Ennis in County Clare. He was only 17. He joined up into the Munster Fusiliers, trained in Ireland, was sent into France. Very difficult to find much about precisely what he did because his record was also destroyed. He had some kind of medical problem, not a wound. He doesn't appear as a casualty, and he was medically downgraded and moved into a thing called the Labour Corps. which carried out manual work in relatively safe areas. But nonetheless, he got his campaign medals, and he was discharged medically unfit. He got an extra thing called a war badge and a disability pension. And I thought that's probably the end of the story. But having looked at a few of these things before, I thought maybe not. I discovered that he then joined the Ennis Company of the Irish Republican Army. And more to the point, I found that mainly through newspaper clippings, because he was executed for his part in a murder in 1923. Now, from a record viewpoint, I've only got fragments about his British Army career. I've been able to rebuild it from medal records, pension records, and the like. But I've got an awful lot more about what he did in his relatively short time in the Irish Republican Army. And actually, that gave me a few more clues about his time in the British Army, which is, from a viewpoint of this particular project, extremely helpful. But a good reminder too that if a man had been in the British Army, doesn't necessarily rule him out from taking an alternative path later on. And in fact, Patrick, here he is, him and two comrades who are named on the same list here, were used in a election poster. That's the chap there, and that's the only photograph of him that I actually found for his family. His family were completely unaware of it. So I've talked about the First World War, 1418. Just a quick word from a genealogy and research viewpoint. The records before and after the First World War differ. If a man served 1921 or later, the format of the records is very similar to the ones you'll find for the First World War, but they're not yet public. They will be at some point, no doubt, but they're not at the moment. So you can get a copy, but you have to fill in a paper application form. You have to send it with a payment to a Ministry of Defence address in Scotland. And can you believe it takes them nearly a year to send the results back to you? They'll probably blame that on COVID, but I'll tell you it was happening long before COVID. But it can be done. So if you have a soldier that you know remained in the British Army or went into the British Army after 1922, you should be able to find his record, and you should be able to get a copy. It'll just be slightly painful in getting it. If you go before the First World War, the records format-wise are quite similar as long ago as about 1870. Before that, the format is different. You don't have the rich collection of medical records and training and goodness knows what you get later on. You tend to have to rely on regimental muster rolls and pay registers and that sort of thing. So they're not as rich, but you can, with care, put a man's story together. The difficulty is that not many of these yet have been digitized. So if you have a man who's, and you know he was serving in, say, 1850, 1860, theoretically, you could probably rebuild his service quite well, but probably have to do that sitting for many hours in the National Archives in London, unfortunately. That's just the way the records are at the moment. So if you're going to try and research your own soldiers, and forgive me, I'm sure a lot of you have, I would recommend, first of all, have a look at my website, because there's a stack of information on it about how to research a soldier. I added that very early on because people would contact me, say, I like all this stuff about regiments, but how do I research my grandfather? So I added this so people wouldn't keep asking the question. And there's lots of it, and it will guide you through exactly where the sources are and how to interpret them and so on. But before you do anything, like any genealogy, gather as much information as you can and that's reliable about his name, his age, where he came from, who his next of kin may have been at the time, any photographs you've got, any medals you've got, any paperwork you've got. Because if you find this later, having had a really difficult time to find something, you will kick yourself. So find it first, drag out the information, and you'll find your searches made rather easier. Unfortunately, to do a thorough job on searching an individual, you really do have to look across a number of sources. Find My Past, Ancestry, and all the other ones I listed, because it is only by doing so that you'll catch every item of detail. And for men resident in Ireland, certainly, unless you're absolutely sure that he wouldn't have had any connection to Irish forces after 1918, for example, if your man had been killed in the First World War, then certainly do look at Irish military archives. You never know what you'll find. Many men in 1922, when the British left and the Free State set up a new regimental structure, there are registers of these things that you can find men in, and they often give details of what happened before. So well worth not forgetting to look at your own archives. And once you've got any documentation, the thing to do is to try to reconstruct the man's timeline of what happened to him and when and why. Military documents are extremely difficult to interpret very often because they have lots of abbreviations, acronyms, codes, regulations are quoted, and so forth. Ask for help. There are lots of places you can go to ask for help. You can get it professionally, or you can go to the many discussion forums on the internet these days that will do that. And you should be able to put it back together. For my own part, I operate two websites. One on the left, they look similar. The Long Trail is all about the British Army, how to research soldiers, how to research units of the army and where they went and what they did. Just about everything you ever needed to know is there. It's very popular. It gets about 6,000 or 7,000 visitors every single day. And with luck, one or two of them might pop and click through to my other website, which is the service I have been operating for years, researching soldiers for a fee, very nominal fee, I have to say. But a lot do. And so it's the experience of, I think I've clicked up about 12,000 individuals now, something like that. You do learn a bit by doing that. So there you are. I hope that's been useful. And I think that's the end. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Stop share, it says. There we are.
Chris, thank you so much. May I take this opportunity on behalf of the Society to thank you and tell you how much I personally was fascinated by the doc and would listen to you all night.